What if everything you've been told about the Bible isn't the full story? What if the very thing many people use to dismiss it, science, is actually beginning to support it? For centuries, the Bible has been treated as a book of faith, not fact. A collection of stories passed down through generations, often labeled as symbolic, exaggerated, or even mythological. And to be fair, in a world driven by evidence, data, and proof, it's easy to see why. Science asks for verification. Faith asks for belief. They've always seemed like opposites. But what happens when those two worlds start to overlap? In recent years, archaeologists have uncovered ancient cities buried beneath layers of time. Historians have decoded inscriptions that mention names once thought to be purely biblical. And scientists, using physics, geology, and advanced simulations, have begun exploring whether some of the most extraordinary events ever recorded could have real, natural explanations. This isn't about proving faith. It's about something far more unsettling. Because if even a fraction of these stories are grounded in reality, then the line between myth and history becomes dangerously thin. And suddenly, the question isn't whether these events happened, but how much of it is true. Think about that for a moment. What if the walls really did fall? What if the sea really did part? What if the figures you thought were symbolic actually walked this earth? In this video, you're about to see 10 biblical events that modern science and archaeology have investigated, some of which have evidence that's hard to ignore. And while each one raises its own questions, there's one in particular, the last one, that goes beyond science entirely. It doesn't just challenge what you know, it challenges what you believe. So don't rush this. Watch closely, because by the end, you might not just see the Bible differently, you might see reality itself differently. Let's begin with something that has challenged believers and skeptics alike for generations. The story of Noah's Arkansas. According to the biblical account, a massive vessel was built to preserve life during a global flood, carrying pairs of every animal species. For many, this has always sounded impossible. Too large, too complex, too unrealistic to ever function in the real world. But in 2014, a group of physics students set out to test that assumption. Using measurements described in ancient texts and applying modern calculations, they reconstructed the ark's dimensions and analyzed its buoyancy. What they found was unexpected. Based on principles of flotation, the structure, if built as described, could theoretically support an enormous load without sinking. Not proof that it existed, but a surprising indication that it could have worked. Then there's the Pool of Siloam, a place mentioned in the Gospel of John as the site of a miraculous healing. For centuries, its existence was debated. Was it symbolic, a metaphor, or a real location lost to time? That question lingered until 2005, when construction workers in Jerusalem uncovered a series of ancient stone steps. Archaeologists were called in, and what they revealed was a water reservoir dating back to the exact period described in the text. Its location, structure, and design matched the biblical account with striking accuracy. Suddenly, what was once considered purely theological had a physical presence, something you could stand beside, touch, and see. Now, consider the Wall of Solomon. The Bible described a powerful king who expanded Jerusalem and fortified it with advanced structures. For years, many scholars questioned whether Jerusalem at that time was even significant enough to support such development. The idea of a grand fortified wall seemed more like exaggeration than history. But in 2010, excavations uncovered a massive structure dating back to the same era attributed to Solomon's reign. The scale, complexity, and strategic placement of the wall suggested a level of organization and strength that aligned closely with the biblical narrative. What was once dismissed as legend began to resemble recorded history. Individually, each of these discoveries might be explained away. A coincidence, perhaps an interpretation stretched to fit a narrative. But when you step back and look at the pattern, something changes. Again and again, stories once labeled as myth are intersecting with tangible evidence, not in ways that answer every question, but in ways that make it harder to ignore them entirely. And that raises a deeper question. If these accounts hold fragments of truth, then what else might we be overlooking? Now the conversation begins to shift, because the next set of events doesn't just sit comfortably within logic, they stretch it. These are the stories that were almost universally dismissed as myth, until evidence started to blur that certainty. Take the Tower of Babel, a story often interpreted as symbolic, explaining why humanity speaks different languages. According to the biblical account, humanity once shared a single language and attempted to build a structure that reached the heavens. In response, their language was confused and they were scattered across the earth. For centuries, this was seen purely as theological storytelling. But then archaeologists uncovered ancient Mesopotamian ziggurats, massive step towers built to reach toward the sky. One particular artifact, a stone tablet, depicts such a tower alongside inscriptions describing its construction. Some scholars believe it may represent a real structure in Babylon, possibly tied to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Suddenly, the idea of a great tower wasn't so far-fetched. And while it does explain the origin of language directly, it raises a question. Was the story inspired by a real event that evolved over time? Then there's the crossing of the Red Sea, one of the most dramatic moments in biblical history. A fleeing population, trapped between an army and a body of water, escapes as the sea parts before them. For many, this has always been viewed as a miracle beyond explanation. But modern researchers have explored whether natural forces could produce a similar effect. Using computer simulations and geographical data, scientists discover that strong, sustained winds, reaching specific speeds and directions, could push water back, temporarily exposing land beneath. This phenomenon, known as a wind set-down, has been observed in other parts of the world. It doesn't diminish the event, it reframes it. What once seemed impossible now exists within the boundaries of nature, though still rare and extraordinary. And then we arrive at Jericho, a fortified city with walls so strong they symbolize impenetrability. According to the Bible, those walls didn't fall through siege or battle, but through an unusual sequence of marching and sound. For a long time, this account was dismissed as dramatic storytelling, but excavations in the region revealed something unexpected. The remains of Jericho show evidence of sudden collapse. Walls that appear to have fallen outward, not inward as typically seen in invasions. Even more intriguing, the destruction seems to align with the time period described in the biblical narrative. It wasn't a slow defeat. It was abrupt, unusual, difficult to explain. And this is where things begin to change. Because now we're no longer looking at isolated examples that can be easily categorized. We're looking at patterns that challenge assumptions. Events once confined to belief are now intersecting with data, artifacts, and scientific models. Not enough to prove everything, but enough to make one thing clear. Maybe these stories weren't simply imagined. Maybe they were remembered. Up to this point, you might still be holding on to a reasonable doubt. Maybe these are coincidences. Maybe interpretations shaped to fit a narrative. But what happens when the evidence stops being theoretical and starts becoming historical? Consider Pontius Pilate, a central figure in the trial of Jesus, described in the Gospels as the Roman governor who authorized the crucifixion. For years, some critics argue that there was no solid evidence outside the Bible confirm he even existed. It raised a troubling possibility. Was this figure added later to give the story structure? That question remained open until 1961, when archaeologists excavating an ancient Roman site uncovered a limestone inscription. Carved into it was a name, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Not a legend, not a metaphor, a documented Roman official, placed exactly where the Bible said he would be, within the exact time period described. Suddenly, a debated figure became a historical one. Then there's the Babylonian captivity, one of the most significant events in the Old Testament. The forced exile of the Jewish people after the fall of Jerusalem was long considered exaggerated by some scholars, but discoveries in ancient Mesopotamian ruins began to tell a different story. Clay tablets, administrative records, were uncovered, listing rations and provisions given to exiled individuals. Among the names were figures that closely matched those recorded in biblical texts, including a king taken into captivity. These weren't stories passed down through generations. They were records written in real time, documenting real people living through displacement, the kind of detail that's difficult to fabricate centuries later. And then there's the City of the Spring, described in biblical accounts as a crucial location tied to the rise of kings and the survival of a people. It was long thought to be symbolic or uncertain in location. But after years of excavation, archaeologists uncovered an ancient fortified structure built around a vital water source. Its age, design, and strategic importance align precisely with the descriptions found in Scripture. This wasn't just a place. It was a functioning system, engineered with intent, supporting a civilization exactly where the Bible said it would be. At some point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. These discoveries don't just confirm isolated events. They validate names, locations, timelines, the kind of details that anchor a narrative in reality. And when those details begin to match consistently, something shifts. Because now, skepticism isn't just about questioning belief. It's about explaining away evidence. And then we come to the moment that changes everything, not just historically, but personally. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most documented events of the ancient world, referenced not only in the Bible, but also in external historical records. A man sentenced under Roman authority, executed in a method reserved for the worst criminals. On the surface, it's a tragic ending, but hidden within that moment is a detail that most people overlook. The cross wasn't originally meant for him. According to the account, there was another man, Barabbas, a prisoner convicted of violence, whose fate had already been decided. The crowd was given a choice: release Jesus or release Barabbas. And against all logic, they chose to free the guilty and condemn the innocent. So the cross prepared for one man became the cross carried by another. Historically, this moment reflects the political tension, the pressure of the crowd, and the authority of Rome. But symbolically, it goes much deeper, because Barabbas wasn't just a man in the story. He represents something uncomfortably familiar, a flawed human being, standing guilty, yet walking free while someone else takes his place. Think about that. The pattern we've seen throughout this journey. Structures, cities, records, events, all point towards something real, something grounded. But this moment points inward. It shifts the focus from what happened to what it means. Because if even part of this story is true, then it isn't just history. It's a message about exchange, about sacrifice, about a kind of love that doesn't operate on fairness, but on intention. And suddenly, the question is no longer whether science can explain the past. It's whether you can ignore what it's pointing to. Maybe science doesn't stand in opposition to faith. Maybe it quietly uncovers a framework around it, piece by piece, leaving behind clues that something deeper has always been there. Not forcing belief, but inviting reflection. So where does that leave you? After everything you've seen, everything you've heard, maybe the real question isn't whether these events happened. Maybe it's what you choose to do with them now. If this made you pause, even for a moment, then don't just move on. Sit with it, question it, explore it, because sometimes the truth doesn't demand attention. It waits for you to notice it.